This video is chapter 26, part 2, all about the endocrine system, specifically focusing on homeostasis, positive and negative feedback. To remind you, the endocrine system is all about hormones. Hormones are proteins that are released by a cell. That hormone then travels through the bloodstream where it reaches a target cell. That target cell has a specific shaped receptor that allows the hormone to bind. At that point, the hormone either enters the cell or stays bound to the receptor, but either way, the goal of the hormone binding is to produce a DNA change in the target cell, meaning causing some kind of genes to turn on or off. Building off of that, homeostasis is maintaining a constant internal environment. Homeostasis has to do with regulation, meaning an organism who is an endotherm or is warm-blooded, who lives in the Antarctic, is not going to suddenly freeze solid. So homeostasis means maintaining that body temperature. Just like you, if you're laying on a beach down south, or if you're out in February in Lombard, your body temperature stays the same. So we call that homeostasis, maintaining body temp. We also try to maintain things other than body temp, such as the amount of sugar that's in your bloodstream is somewhat regulated so that even in periods where you're not eating, your cells still have a supply of sugar available. Also, water retention. We try to maintain the amount of water balance in our blood by peeing more or peeing less. So homeostasis is not only temperature, but temperature is one example of that. We saw these terms in our cellular respiration unit during semester 1. An endotherm is an organism that controls body temp. So you and I, along with other mammals, are endotherms. Whether we are in the cold or we are in the hot, body temp is pretty much always the same. We use ATP, meaning we use energy to keep that temperature the same. Certain other organisms, insects, birds, reptiles, do not maintain body temp. They are ectotherms. If an ectotherm is put in the cold, the body temp significantly drops. That then slows down metabolism, slows down functioning in the organism. If an ectotherm is put into the heat, body temperature significantly rises. This could cause denaturing of proteins. So in an ectotherm, body temp greatly varies with environmental temperature. In terms of temperature, an endotherm maintains homeostasis, whereas an ectotherm would not. In an endotherm that does regulate temperature, we call that regulation negative feedback. You will be responsible for seeing a variety of examples and identifying if they are positive or negative feedback. First is a non-biology example. Negative feedback. The output reduces the output. So an example of that is like the thermostat in your house, which works with your furnace to heat it. You set a specific temperature. Your house, your furnace, works to maintain that temperature. If the temperature of your house dips too low, the heater kicks on, produces heat, that then causes the temperature to go up, and thus it would turn the heater off. So the output reduces the output. The heat from the heater shuts the heater off. I tend to think of negative feedback as a happy point. There's some amount of something that the body wants, and if it dips too high or too low, the body will work to get back to that happy point. temperature is an example of that inside the body. You have a set point, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit-ish, and your brain works hard to maintain that set point. If it gets too hot, you'll start to sweat. Your blood will come closer to the surface of your skin. Those things would reduce the temperature and tell your brain things are back to normal, so we can shut off that pathway. Similarly, if it gets too cold, you'll bring your appendages in closer to you. Your muscles might move a little bit. You won't be sweating. Your blood vessels will dilate and get smaller, bringing blood to the core of your body. So as it gets too cold, your body will cause an increase in temperature, and then your brain would shut that off once it returns to its happy point. A few additional examples. Blood calcium level is an example. If you consume a lot of calcium-rich foods, so dairy, like cheese, milk, yogurt, if you eat a lot of calcium-rich foods, your body will identify that there's too much calcium in the bloodstream, and thus you could either save some or get rid of it. So you then have hormones in your thyroid that talk to other parts of your body. They talk to your bones and talk to your kidneys. And when calcium level is too high, you can store some calcium in your bone, or you'll just pee it out. You don't need it. That then will return back to the happy amount of calcium that your body wants. If your calcium level dips too low because you're not consuming calcium-rich foods, your body will go into storage. So it'll go into the bones to pull out the storage. It'll tell your kidney, stop peeing out calcium, we need this stuff. And then also your body will try to extract more calcium from food. That's controlled by a different hormone. But again, the idea is we have a happy point, stay at the happy point. How do we do that? We use hormones that are released by one gland and used somewhere else. An additional example is the urine output one. You have a hormone in your body, ADH, that tells you how much urine to produce. If you've drank too much water, you don't need to save extra water, so you'll produce less hormone and you'll produce more urine. If you are dehydrated or have been exercising a lot, your body will produce ADH that's produced in the brain, and it will go to target the kidney and less urine will be produced. So ADH is a hormone that keeps water in the bloodstream. It's released by part of the brain and used by the kidney. Again, we want to keep our happy set point of the amount of water necessary in the bloodstream. An additional example is thyroxine. Thyroxine is used by the thyroid to regulate cellular respiration and how much ATP is made. You will be responsible for understanding how to read diagrams like this. A huge part of the endocrine system AP questions are diagram reading of questions that look like this, or diagrams that look like this. So what I see in this diagram are three body parts: part of the brain, my thyroid, which is in my neck. So I see different body parts. Each of those body parts releases a different hormone. I've got a hormone thyroxine, a hormone TSH, and a hormone TRH. Once this pathway begins, it only ends at thyroxine. So once my hypothalamus releases TRH, that then tells the pituitary to make TSH, which tells the thyroid gland to make thyroxine. So once my pathway starts, it goes to completion. The end product is the only one that can shut off the pathway. So if I had, let's say, an excess amount of TSH, that would stimulate the thyroid gland, and I would end up with an excess amount of thyroxine, because once I trigger something on the pathway goes to completion. However, the end product can shut off the pathway. So once my body has enough thyroxine, and I'm at the happy amount of thyroxine, my hypothalamus would be shut off. That then would not produce a hormone, which would not trigger the pituitary, which would not release that hormone, which would not trigger the thyroid. Therefore, I'm preventing overproduction of thyroxine. So I can shut off my pathway here on the left by using the end product to do that. Similarly, on the right side of the pathway, thyroxine also shuts off the anterior pituitary. So it's just another way to confirm that excess thyroxine will not be made. So in all of these diagrams, which you could be given a huge variety of them, once the pathway begins, it goes to completion. The end product is the only one that can shut off, which is inhibit or to turn off. The end product is the only one that can stop the pathway. Thyroxine controls cellular respiration. You don't need to memorize the function of individual hormones, but this just kind of gives you a little background information. It's not ideal to have not enough thyroxine, because if you don't have enough thyroxine, you have a very low metabolism. Your body's not producing enough ATP. There's a host of issues that come from that. If your happy point is not met in the other direction because you have too much thyroxine, that also is considered unhealthy. You have an extremely high metabolic rate, heart is racing all the time, other symptoms as listed in this table. So you don't need to memorize the specific hormones or impacts, but more think big picture. There's a set amount that you need. Too much or too little is a bad thing. An additional example of negative feedback is that of blood glucose. People who have diabetes have issues with blood glucose levels. If you consume food, you raise your blood sugar level, meaning there's more sugar available for your cells. When that blood sugar level is high, you release insulin, and insulin then puts that sugar into your cells, which is a good thing because your cells need sugar to do cellular respiration and make ATP. So insulin allows the cell to let glucose in. If there's an excess of glucose, your liver can store some of it for periods of time when you don't eat. That will then return blood sugar levels back to their happy point. If blood sugar levels are low due to a lack of eating, your body will dip into that storage using another hormone called glucagon. It will dip into that storage, pull the glucose out, and again return to the happy amount of glucose. So the way that insulin works is it allows the cell to take in glucose. That then causes blood sugar level to drop. We can see that in this diagram on the lower left. There's receptors for insulin. Insulin binds to the receptor. Insulin opens a channel, and when it opens the channel, glucose can come in to drop blood sugar level. So insulin works as like the doorman who opens the door to allow glucose to come in. Glucagon works the opposite. Glucagon will go into the storage to get more glucose out. Diabetes is a disruption of glucose, meaning a disruption usually of insulin. There's two different types of diabetes here. There's also a third type, which has to do with pregnancy. But essentially in a healthy cell, insulin should bind. and insulin should allow glucose to enter the cell. In somebody with type 1 diabetes, that insulin in the pancreas is not properly made. So there's no doorman to open the channel to let glucose in. So the cells end up not having enough glucose because the glucose is there in the bloodstream, but it can't get into the cell. Somebody who has type 2 diabetes can make insulin, but for whatever reason, the insulin doesn't bind and doesn't open the channel. So they do make the hormone insulin, but then still the problem is that the glucose cannot get into the cell. So this is a disruption of the negative feedback loop. There's a happy amount of glucose that should be in the bloodstream, and diabetes is a disruption of that. Positive feedback is the opposite of negative feedback. In positive feedback, the input increases the input. I kind of think of it like exponential growth. Things are getting crazy. Here is an example that's not really a biology example, but it essentially says that as there's cattle running, as cows start running, it causes panic in cows, which causes more of them to run, which causes more of them to panic, more of them to run. This is a cycle until it is completely booted and completely over. So I kind of think of it like exponential growth. Things are getting amplified, bigger and bigger. Some biology examples. Most common positive feedback examples have to do with childbirth. So here is one where a baby is inside the uterus, and the base of the uterus is called the cervix, which is the opening that the baby needs to exit through during delivery. In positive feedback, we see an amplification where things become more and more intense. When a woman is in labor, her uterus contracts and squishes in on the baby. That is a contraction. That then causes the baby's head to move downwards. There's nerve endings in the cervix that communicate to part of the brain that then communicates back to the uterus to squish again. And when the uterus contracts again, the baby's head pushes again on the cervix. This causes more contractions, which causes more pushing of the baby's head on the cervix, which causes more contraction and more pushing, more contraction, more pushing until bam, the baby is out. At that point, then, there would be no contractions and no pushing on the cervix because there's no baby there. So it's an amplification of the signal. Another example of this is breastfeeding. The more a woman breastfeeds, the more milk she produces, which will probably cause her to breastfeed more, which would produce more milk, and this is again a huge amplification. So as the baby suckles on the nipple, it stimulates the neurons, the nerves in the nipple to tell the brain that there's a baby there and to produce more milk. Well, if there's more milk coming out of the nipple, the woman will probably have the baby suckle the nipple more, which then causes this cycle again to amplify until at some point the woman cuts the baby off. So you should be familiar with the difference between positive and negative feedback and also how to read those negative feedback diagrams.